Welcome, everybody. Once again, my name is Kirk Hanson, and I am the Director of Forestry for the Northwest Natural Resource Group. And we have been hosting these fireside chats every month for the past year, covering a wide range of topics relating to forestry in the Northwest, to small woodlands management. And we're going to continue this series at least up through the end of the year. It's been fairly popular so far. We may continue it through next year as well. I've been really enjoying meeting a lot of new people and bringing a lot of different guest speakers in to cover topics that are a little bit outside of my wheelhouse. Tonight is one of those topics. The topic is biochar, and I'm really grateful to have a good friend and colleague, Kai Hoffman-Krull, join us. He's the Forest Health Director from the San Juan Conservation District. And Kai and I have worked for years together in the San Juans, providing educational programs, workshops, technical assistance to small woodland owners up there. And in fact, we have a workshop coming up this Saturday on Lopez Island on managing forests for health, wildlife habitat, timber production. So if you are not familiar with that or not aware of that, I encourage you to take a look at my organization's website, NNRG.org. And I think Alex might be able to put a link in the chat function there. That'll take you directly to the sign up page for that workshop. It's a free workshop. It's at Midnight's Farm on Lopez. And we'll be talking about all things forestry in the San Juans. Again, tonight's topic, biochar. Kai is joining us, and I'm going to pass this over to him shortly here, but it's a fascinating topic to me. And I think in working with Kai, I've really learned a lot about forest ecology, fire ecology in the San Juans, and the kind of critical role that biochar, or fundamentally charcoal, plays in forest ecosystems. And never really realized that was one of the kind of missing components of regular fire return intervals in our fire-dependent ecosystems. This is a kind of a rich topic, and I've given Kai the unenviable task of defining biochar and describing its ecological significance within about a 30-minute time frame. So Kai's going to talk about that, and then we're going to open it up for kind of a question and answer period throughout Kai's presentation. If you have questions, you can type them into the chat box at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a little chat icon there for folks that may not be familiar with the Zoom platform. You can click on that, type in your question. And Alex, who's been coordinating all of these fireside chats for us, will moderate those after Kai's presentation, pose those questions to Kai. And then we'll just open it up for more of a general discussion after that, kind of an informal conversation. And ostensibly, primarily about biochar, but happy to talk about other topics outside of that as well. So with that as an introduction, Kai, I'd love to turn it over to you and hear what you have to say about biochar. Thank you for joining us.
Well, Kirk, it's really a pleasure to be here. And, as shared, it's just been a great last 6 or 7 years working with NNRG. So fun to be continuing in this digital format. And then, of course, getting to see you soon. So thanks so much for the introduction. All right, well, I'm going to do that whole share screen thing and share a bit of a PowerPoint. In our modern age, we do these things. Around a subject that I've been really involved with for roughly the last 10 years. And there's a longer story for how I got into this that involves me learning how to use a chainsaw, but I won't get into that right at the moment. I actually want to jump into some people that I met when I moved to Waldron about 12 years ago. This is Sally and Chris Weaver. And I knew them as homesteaders on Waldron, and also people that had really amazing gardens. And I was really interested in organic agriculture at that point, and was learning quite a bit from different people And this garden that their family has had for the last 80 or 90 years is this site out on Sandy Point. And Sandy Point is truthful to its name. It's like if you go along the beach there, you can see the soil profile. And it's light brown sand, just relatively nutrient poor for growing conditions. Decent for fruit trees, but not an easy site for gardening. But there's this area, and the photo was taken in black and white, and I'm in some ways glad because it really accentuates how dark the soil is in this one area. You can walk across the soil profile from the water, and it goes from light brown sand to about almost 4 feet of jet black soil. And when you stick your hand in this garden soil, it's so black that it stays in your hands for something almost like a day or two. You just can't get it out. And it was then through a research project with University of Washington, which we'll be talking quite a bit about some of those results in a minute. Dr. Tom DeLuca and Dr. C. Gao were the two main colleagues on that project. We looked at this soil and did some soil tests and found out there were incredibly high rates of charcoal all the way 4 feet deep into this soil. And this was also a historic camas garden. And for those of you who don't know, camas was one of the staple crops of Coast Salish diets, very much sort of a potato starchy item that was then cooked for extensive periods of time, 1 to 2 days, and then became digestible, and again was like a major piece of the Coast Salish diet, and also is a native lily to the islands and to the region. So this site, again, I want to talk about, and again, we'll get to the research results in a bit, but we did 10 different farms on this research project with the University of Washington. And looking at, all of the best people that you find at many of the local farmers markets, if you go to San Juan or Orcas. And this site that was this historic camps garden had double the caddying exchange capacity of the highest farm in all of those 10 farm studies. And so I start with this piece around this camas garden, because that was one of the first times that I really changed my thinking about this issue. I originally got into the whole piece around biochar thinking, okay, this is a really exciting potential product that we can develop. We can make it from forest restoration projects. We have all this excess biomass in our forest that we're trying to thin out because of congestion. And if you've been listening to these talks, I'm sure you've been hearing quite a bit about this subject from Kirk and from other specialists talking on this. So I was really thinking about it from sort of a products standpoint, which I think it still is, and I think we'll definitely speak to that later. But this really changed my thinking to really understanding, oh wow, charcoal was a byproduct of fire in this ecosystem in the San Juan Islands for thousands of years, and has been used both in forest soils as well as agricultural soils for that duration of time. And again, just restructured my thinking of this dichotomy between forestry and farming, or ecology and food production. And so I want to actually jump away from charcoal for a second to Gary Oak ecosystems. And again, this is a great image because we oftentimes think about Gary Oaks as this keystone species in our region. But this image captures the large amount of camas that grew in these ecosystems as understory lilies here. And again, I talked a bit about camas before. And these ecosystems were cultivated with fire. And these areas were burned often in the spring after camas was harvested. And then sometimes later in the fall as well, with 2 burns. And I want to talk a little bit about how the Gary Oak structure of the tree lends itself to this fire ecology. So Gary Oaks showed up in our region right around 9,000 to 10,000 years ago. And the structure of these of a branch for a Gary oak, you have this terminal bud, which is what is the lead bud that turns into the next branch. But then you have these lateral buds next to it. Hopefully you can see my cursor. And these lateral buds obviously go laterally. But then underneath these lateral buds, you have these epicormic buds. And those epicormic buds stay latent most of the time. There's actually a hormone that goes throughout the branch that says, okay, don't bud out. And then when a fire moves through that landscape, it stops the hormone from going through this branch. And actually that epicormic bud becomes a lateral bud and starts to send branches out. And so this is an incredibly effective method because it is insulated beneath this bark structure. The bark actually grows over the epicormic buds, and also that they hide underneath these lateral buds, because if you were to cut open these buds, you get these huge amounts of space. I mean, obviously, relatively speaking, because they're very small, but a significant amount of space between the layers of these lateral buds and these terminal buds that insulates them from fire. So it's so that the tree can actually top kill completely, or it can partially top kill when a fire moves through, but then have this whole capacity for regeneration and epicormic growth. So I say this to showcase how that plant was designed for having, in essence, fire moving through that landscape, and in many ways evolved over these last 10,000 years with the people of this landscape that were actively cultivating both the understory and Gary oaks for food production. And this is a great chance to then go back to this definition that we have, Merriam-Webster definition of wilderness, which is a tracker region of uncultivated or uninhabited by human beings. And the second one I think is actually even more significant. An area essentially undisturbed by human activity, together with its naturally developed life community. Now, I think the second one is really important to focus on because it frames, both of them really do this, but I think the second one does it even more obviously. It frames human activity as separate from the developed life community, right? So that there's this other world outside of humans. And then this other piece of this definition is the undisturbed part, as though humans were not involved in these wilderness areas. And to a European, this definition makes a lot of sense, but to somebody who is from this region, and Coast Salish people lived in this region for 14,000 years, it's really hard to grasp that time scale. That's before Rome, that's before the Egyptian pyramids, that is before the last ice age in this region. And so I want us to think about it for a moment of, if all of the supermarkets, all of the farmers markets, all of the gardens that we have all suddenly stopped existing, how would that make us feel? And I think for most of us, that would be, myself included, that'd be a terrifying notion. I'd be like, well, what am I going to eat? What's going to sustain me? But that's what people lived in and thrived in for the last 14,000 years. And so I think this is a really important definition to unpack because of this separation that we have between agriculture and cultivation and then the wilderness. And there's really no, I don't personally have a better link between these two concepts of, in essence, the forest or the wilderness that say separate from humans or undisturbed from humans, and then the cultivated space of cropland than charcoal, because charcoal was both a natural byproduct of forest fires that were naturally caused by lightning strikes, as well as then an actively created product by humans, not only in our region. There's a significant history of charcoal use in the Amazon, in Japan, by the Greeks and Romans, in Hawaii. This was an active decision that many cultures made to be using charcoal in their agricultural production. So what is charcoal? What is biochar? And when I'm saying these terms, I will say them pretty much interchangeably, because biochar is kind of the new term that we use for this new thing, this new product, but really it's as old as charcoal itself, which is really as old as fire itself. So what is charcoal? It is these long chains of carbon-carbon bonds that is also known as recalcitrant carbon. And biochar sequesters, in essence, 56 to 65% of the dry weight carbon dioxide. Sorry, stumbling over my words a little bit. And so that means that when you're looking at a piece of biomass, the process of pyrolysis, which is the process of making charcoal, in essence is sequestering 56 to 65% of that total dry weight, which is an incredibly high amount. And this does this for up to 5,000 to 8,000 years, depending on the heat and temperature that it's produced at. Now, there are versions of charcoal that certainly go far under those numbers. Very low heat charcoals can sometimes only last in soils for 300 to 400 years, but most of the charcoal that would be a byproduct of fires and our wood stoves, fires that we would create out in the forest, those charcoals have a much larger carbon half-life, which then is entering something closer to 2,500 year half-life, which then means that some of that charcoal is still resonance in soil, has resonance in soil for up to 5,000 to 8,000 years. So again, I'm trying to emphasize the time process, not only for carbon storage, but then the benefits of that charcoal in soils, such as the benefits that we first saw in that UW trial where we looked at that historic camas garden and the charcoal within it. So now I talked about that cationic exchange capacity piece, and now I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that cationic exchange means. What for that historic camas garden? What is that process? And in essence, one way to summarize it is nutrient holding capacity. What is the number of particles on soil and that can hold on to nutrients? What is the total nutrient holding capacity for those soil? And so this is a study from Dr. Tom DeLuca, who we worked with, summarizing sort of a meta-analysis of a number of different papers on forest biochar. And this is just two kind of key highlights in the conclusion section, illustrating that charcoal has been shown to increase soil water holding capacity, increase cationic exchange capacity, increase base saturation of mineral soils, and alter soil pH, as well as then enhance the microbial communities. And we're going to be speaking to some of that later in some of the study results. So this cationic exchange piece is really significant. And this is one of the ways, again, that we measure the resilience of soils by its ability to hold on to nutrients. And so one of the best ways to think about this cationic exchange capacity piece is how many parking lot spots are there on a soil particle? How many exchange sites can hold on to nutrients? Then, and then the base saturation piece, which again, these are, forgive me if this is kind of too down the soil scientist route, but I think it's important to understand why these elements of charcoal and fire have such significance to our soils. Base saturation is a way of measuring how many of these parking lots are full of things that aren't helpful, mainly hydrogen, and how much of those are open for other cations and other essential nutrients to be able to bond to that soil particle and then interact with plant roots. And so here's a kind of, annoying graphic in some ways, but just in terms of visual quality, but a very great representation of how a soil particle has these different exchange sites. So here you have all these different exchange sites, these negative exchange sites. You have this little magnesium molecule, this potassium molecule, this calcium molecule, and then you have all these hydrogen molecules. And again, as I said, hydrogen is a very abundant resource in the universe, but it's not very helpful for growing plants. Plants can't really metabolize hydrogen, but hydrogen does bond to these exchange sites. And calcium and magnesium, which is the main elements that we see in ash content, those break off these hydrogen molecules and allow for these other pieces like potassium to be able to then absorb and bond on to that exchange site. So, but then also, not only is this calcium magnesium piece of ash, so critical for keeping those exchange sites open. We also then need more of these exchange sites to be able to hold on to increasingly higher amounts of nutrients. And that is what biochar has usually, depending on the feedstock type, but for the most part, it has an incredibly high cation exchange capacity. So it has all these different exchange sites to be able to bond to other nutrients and increase then their transport in the soil solution to root hairs of different plants. So again, just an image of sort of byproduct of a forest fire, then seeing the resulting ash and charcoal that comes from it. And again, in a historic context, in our region, roughly 4 to 6% of the total biomass of forest fires were turned into charcoal. So that was coming on a regular fire return interval, introducing charcoal roughly every 100 to 150 years into the soil. And certainly in certain situations, there's research to show areas like Cattle Bluff, fire return intervals were sometimes as small as 4 years. Areas like Point Disney on Waldron Island, where I live, illustrations in some of those Gary Oak savannas of fire return intervals of 7 to 10 years. So fire was an essential and foundational part of these ecosystems, returning on a very regular basis and then influencing the soil each time it passed through. So biochar is then also, obviously not just been a part of ecosystems in our region, but also across the world. And there was this meta-analysis paper produced in 2015 that got an incredible amount of interest because it illustrated a 41% of overall biomass increase with trees that were grown in biochar. And the responses were most extreme in early stages of growth, up to 10 years. And so that paper looked at 395 different studies throughout the globe and found these very shocking and extreme numbers. And so that is getting a lot of interest, of course, for forestry companies, certainly ecologists, trying to think about how to increase those early stages of growth, especially in a changing climate when we're looking at more stress and more challenges for trees getting established and trying to enter into that new succession. So now we enter into a study that I did with Dr. Tom DeLuca and Dr. C. Gao. They actually, when I first worked with them, that was at University of Washington, they actually moved to Oregon State University, where Tom is now the dean of the forestry school at OSU. And so this is a summary of a project we started in 2020, and we're actually just finishing up the paper right now. So that paper will be published likely at the end of this year. So anyways, you're getting some of the results before our paper's even been published, which is, so you're at the cutting edge of it all. So we looked at 3 different sites. We looked at a summit site, which we were trying to understand how biochar influenced highly drained soils that were certainly sandier, lower cation exchange capacity, lower overall carbon and organic matter levels. So you can see kind of the short summary here is C, carbon and nutrient poor. C stands for carbon here. Then we have a back slope, sort of a mid-slope section, site 2, that was higher organic matter, but still, obviously in this moderate category. And then we looked at a low slope, or what's called toe slope, right before a wetland that had high clay content, high carbon organic matter, and high nutrient count. And so we looked at 2 different species types. We planted both alder as well as Doug fir. We looked at 4 different biochar rates, and we replicated the same study at all 3 sites. So each site was its own study, but then each study was replicated 3 times to give us this comparison between those 3. Here you get an example, an image of those different saplings being planted with the different biochar amounts. And so we looked at 0 tons per hectare, which is obviously the control, and then 20 tons per hectare, 40 tons per hectare, and 80 tons per hectare. And each site, we did that 4 different times. So these were some of the really key significant findings between the first and second. We sampled 3 different times, and so this is results after the third sampling. You can see water holding capacity was significantly increased and at a direct correlation between the amount amended into the soil. So you can see basically, the 20 tons per hectare everything jumps up significantly with the 40 tons per hectare, and then increases again with the 80 tons per hectare. The water holding capacity is what's known as a physochemical element of charcoal. It doesn't change significantly over time, and is in essence just part of the structural elements of charcoal, because many of the pore spaces that have the gases that burn off during the fire process leaves all these little holes in the charcoal that then can absorb water. And so they say that 1 tablespoon of charcoal has as much square footage as a football field, just to illustrate how many little gaps and small pockets there are in charcoal. And so again, those are part of what then absorbs that water and then lets it out slowly. So again, a direct correlation between the amount of charcoal added and the water holding capacity. And really, that's probably the most important element that we studied, the most important question that we asked, in large part because San Juan County is both in the rain shadow and currently experiences long, droughty summers, but also the DNR has predicted that between 2020 and 2040, San Juan County is going to experience the highest increase of drought conditions of anywhere in Western Washington. Any populated area in Western Washington. There's some random spot out in the Cascades where nobody lives that's also supposed to get incredibly droughty. But where people are concerned, we're it. So that is obviously a huge concern then for both the trees and the ecosystems that are currently here, as well as trying to establish new trees and how to get those young starts through those long droughty summers. This increase of water holding capacity is obviously really significant for some of that establishment. Bulk density is a way of obviously just looking at the density of soil, and we also saw direct correlations, significant drop off between the control and 80 tons per hectare, and pretty much consistent between the 3 sites. So that increases the pliability of soil and ease for roots to be able to move through and get established and access both nutrients and water. So that was another significant finding. Total carbon content, as we know from the beginning, biochar created these long carbon-carbon bonds, and so we expected to see a consistent rate of carbon increase at all 3 sites, and that certainly was true. But I think one of the most significant parts of this was that we saw the most extreme carbon increase of storage in the upper site, which is the most carbon poor of any of the 3 sites. So that was really significant, because in areas where we are seeing the most challenges for soil carbon and organic matter, biochar may have the most significance in influencing those areas. Now, basal respiration is an element of how soil breathes out carbon. And, again, a lot of these terms sound kind of weird and sciencey, but I just want you to imagine that as we're walking around all the time, the earth is breathing. It's sending carbon out and it's receiving carbon in. And so this is a great way to analyze what is that respiration rate? How is that carbon off-gassing from our soil? And this found, again, a steady correlation of reduction of that carbon off-gassing at all 3 sites, but most extreme actually the lower site, which was the most high carbon content to start with. Then nitrogen, and so the first NH4 is ammonium, and that's what's termed organic nitrogen, or which is actually, usually we think of organic as a good thing. In soil chemistry, actually, inorganic is what you're trying to get to. It's the more processed of the element by the microbial activity in the soil. So ammonium is sort of the starting point for nitrogen, and then we're trying to get to nitrate, which is the more bioavailable form nitrogen. And nitrogen is really significant for plants because it's responsible for protein establishment. So, when we see bright green, healthy plants, big leaves, big needles, Kirk, when he walks into the forest, he's looking for what's a robust crown of a tree. Well, a huge part of that robust protein development in those leaves or needles is nitrogen. And so we're trying to see a higher amount of this nitrogen. And what's interesting is that in the first time we sampled in December of 2020, we saw only a reduction of ammonium and an increase of nitrate in the mid-slope site, which we were surprised by. It actually was the one we thought sort of might least have this sort of nutrient influence. But then when we sampled again in August 2021, we saw that the lower and mid sites both had the same phenomenon of reduction of ammonium, increase of nitrate. And so that is showing that the mineralization process is being increased in both of these sites. And that's really significant because we're more interested in nitrogen that can be easily utilized by trees and plants than forms of nitrogen that cannot. Alex, how am I doing on time? I'm getting close towards the end, but I just wanted to 8:05. Should I?
You're good. Yeah.
All right. I'll try to cruise through this last part. So now I want to touch base on some of the farm results that we did back in 2015, 2016. And I know this is a forestry presentation, but it's, I think, really important to be linking these concepts of forestry and agriculture and understanding that soil resilience didn't live in the dichotomy of forestry and agriculture. For soil resilience went between the two and is as important in one as it is the other. As we were talking about earlier, agriculture and forestry were one and the same for most of the last 14,000 years in our region. So here we're looking at some of those different 10, this is the study that those 10 different farms produced that I talked about at the beginning. And we basically established these 1 square meter plots all throughout these different farm beds and did 4 different types of application. We looked at charcoal, we looked at control, which is nothing, obviously. Then we looked at just a fertilizer amendment, and then we looked at biochar without any fertilizer, and then we looked at biochar with the same amount of fertilizer that was used in the second plot. So 4 different total treatments. And in essence, then you get the difference between the control and the biochar. The only difference between those two is the biochar, and then you have the poultry litter and the charged char. And again, the only difference between those two is the biochar. And so these numbers then represent the differences between the 2 years, 2015, 2016. The difference between control and biochar being the 20% and the 46%, and then the difference between poultry litter and the charged char being 7% and 47%. So, this first one is looking at soil microbial biomass, which is in essence just a way of understanding how much active microbial activity are we seeing in soil. It's looking at, it's somewhat agnostic to whether we're seeing bacteria or mycelium, bacteria or fungal systems in soil, but it's just trying to understand total soil microbial activity. And so we see a significant increase, right? 20% in 2015, 7% in 2000, the charged char being the difference between the poultry litter at 7%, but then to see a very significant increase, in the second year, right, 2016. So 46% increase between the control and the biochar, and then a 47% between the charged char and the poultry litter. We see again a consistent differences in total soil carbon, which we anticipated, these 35% numbers, 40 and 35% numbers, somewhat consistent with the forest soil results. Soil water holding capacity, which we also looked at in soil, in the forest soils, we saw basically the same amount of increase as we actually did in the forest soils, but of course we were only looking at 20 tons per hectare in the farm study, so only one of the amounts that we were looking at in the forest soil study. But yeah, we see also then a more significant increase in the second year, which is notable, and again a more extreme increase with the slightly increased with the charged char as the straight biochar, but not significant at all. Then the accumulated, we were basically looking at nitrogen leaching in soil. So we put these resin capsules below the plants. We were looking at squash, and we were trying to see if we were reducing that nitrogen leaching, and we saw 13 and 33% reduction. So the charged char actually had a much higher reduction of leaching. Of course, it had more nitrogen introduced, but also then had a much higher increase of retaining and holding that nitrogen. And then, of course, yield is significant. So we saw a 13% increase with the charged char between the poultry litter, and then 28% increase between the biochar and the control. This is only 2016. And then one of the last pieces I want to really end with, which is this microdialysis meter, which is actually a way of tracking nutrient density in leaf tissue. So you can actually shoot this laser gun. They're about $40,000. I can't afford one. But you can shoot this laser, and it interacts with the element in that leaf tissue, and then sends back a response laser, basically a refraction of that laser, that tells the machine how much of that nutrient is in that leaf. And so we were looking at, in 2015, we grew dry beans, and we looked at the overall nutrient amounts of copper, iron, manganese, zinc, and calcium in these dry beans. And we saw a consistent correlation between, we were looking at dry beans from QFC, dry beans from the 10 farms that we were doing the research project on, and then the dry beans that were grown with biochar. And we averaged, in essence, the numbers of the poultry litter charged char with the straight biochar. And in essence, we saw a consistent correlation of increase of the dry beans grown with biochar. And so I think this is really important to think that, with the food that we eat, it's not all created equal, right? The food has different nutrients that's available to our bodies. And the more that nutrients is available to the plants that we grow in our gardens or the plants that grow in the farms that we get our food from, the more that nutrients then is available to us when we eat that food. So really a significant finding. I'm going to go through just at the end, what are some ways that biochar is produced? And on a homestead scale or on a small scale forest, small forest landowner who's wanting to produce biochar for your farm or garden or for your forests, these flame cap kilns are a great method because they're basically just a straight cylinder that you can continue to add wood into throughout the whole burn process. And in essence, the way that it works is that the sides of the barrel are excluding oxygen from getting into the fire. And then as the firebox rises, as you add more material, the flames are eating up all the oxygen that would try to get down to the material below. And so the material below the flame box is, for the most part, kept in an oxygen-free environment. And so as you keep adding material, the fire keeps rising, and you end up increasing your amount of charcoal. We also have these conservation burns that are becoming a part of landscape management on many of the public lands in the islands. And these burns are strategic ways of making burn piles that look to have all of the biomass reach coal stage at one point and then extinguish those fires at that point. And so we've actually been making these piles with the Islands Conservation Corps, which is now in our third year. It's a conservation corps that works on all of the different public lands in the San Juan Islands, and much of our work is in forest restoration and in Gary Oak restoration specifically, both cutting out excess biomass and opening up light access for Gary Oaks and other tree species, and then processing a lot of that biomass, both in the form of decomposition for increasing organic matter, as well as producing charcoal. And these are some images of a few of the piles that we made last year and that we're going to be burning when we hit burn season this year. So I want to end with this sort of macro look, right? So 30% of our total carbon emissions as humans are absorbed by our forests. Our forests play this massive role in the total global carbon cycle. And we live in one of these areas that is one of the highest rates of absorption of carbon of any area on the globe, second highest to the Amazon. Pacific Coast forests absorb 93 metric tons of carbon. And so that is, or basically are storing that 93 metric tons of carbon. And so that's an incredible amount of carbon that our forests are keeping out of the atmosphere and utilizing as this central element for growth and for keeping the whole microbial machinery operating in the soil environment. And when these forests burn in these catastrophic ways that are not producing charcoal, many of the catastrophic fires we experience are producing 0.2, 0.4% charcoal, whereas historic fires were producing somewhere between 4 to 6% of total biomass as charcoal. These catastrophic fires are burning up all our carbon and releasing it into the atmosphere, where it's obviously a huge challenge with climate change. But if we are able to thin our forests and do many of the methods that Kirk talks about on these talks or in workshops, then when fire moves through that landscape, it's operating more in that historic fire regime influence of that 4 to 6% total conversion to charcoal, and is creating a lot less heat and sterilization of the soil, and providing a lot of those soil benefits that we spoke about that are part of how to increase that soil resiliency and help those plants thrive and be the most resilient they can be in our changing climate. And I just end with this image of prescribed fire in a Gary Oak setting, because I think there are many different strategies and solutions that are going to be a part of how we address this issue of resilience. But fire has been a part of this landscape for thousands and thousands of years, both naturally occurring and also through humans. And I would say even that dichotomy of naturally occurring and humans is a part of the inherent problem of how we think about ecology. And I think the next steps, both myself and I hope many of us, as we think about these issues of landscape scale resiliency, I think we really have to think historically and how these ecosystems evolved to then be able to understand how we can steward them best into the future. So with that, I know I went over my time, but I look forward to answering any questions.
Fantastic, Kai. Thank you. That speaking of nutrient dense, that was a very nutrient dense presentation, and I can always expect that from you. Thank you. Yeah, with the time that we have left, I'd like to open it up to folks. If anybody has questions of Kai, either relating to the role of biochar in forest ecology or in the manufacturing process of that in your own woodlands. What thoughts or questions do people have out there? And maybe just to stimulate some.
Yeah, one.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. How much do those flame cap kilns cost?
That's a great question. Depends on how you get one. So there are some local metalworking shops that will fabricate them from new steel. And there's actually a person, Kelpie Wilson, who has been designing these flame cap kilns and has specs on her website, which is Wilson Biochar Associates. She has specs that will help a metal shop create one of these from scratch. And I think roughly they're around $1,000 if you have them made new. Now, we made a number of these ourselves on Waldron and in the islands, just using old propane tanks. Now, this is a more intricate process than I will be able to explain over this Zoom link. The biggest piece, just to emphasize, is please fill it up with water before you cut into it, because you have to displace the gas. But it's a great way to use a recycled product, because propane tanks, once they have a little blemish in them, can't be used for propane anymore. But you have this incredible piece of 3/8 steel that's ideal for these sort of situations. So we have made a number of tanks out of the 120 gallons, sometimes the 250 gallon, and then sometimes 1,000 gallon tanks. So that's been sort of our key method. Takes a little bit of experience with metalworking, but certainly can be done.
Thank you.
This might be a difficult question to answer, but one question that I've had about manufacturing biochar in my woods, dispersing it out. I'm trying to get a sense of how much I need to make in order to have a meaningful impact in my forest. Can you help us put that into context?
Totally. Yeah. So I think that the most impactful way to think about charcoal in our forests is to really think about what we are looking to either support that currently exists, or what are we trying to plant. And oftentimes the production of biochar creates a very nice amount. If you do the conservation burns, which I talked about, mostly branches that then you light off, and it's like around a 15 to 20 minute burn process, and then those branches all reach coal stage, and then you extinguish it with water. Or sometimes when it's raining, you can even just rake it into a really wet understory and extinguish the coals that way. At that sort of density, you can just plant straight into it, and it actually works. You kind of, as you're doing your planting of a bare root, such as a Saskatoon or an elderberry, just mixing in some of the charcoal that's in that small pile, or maybe even like a 5 to 6 foot radius pile, then it's just really easy to incorporate it as you're doing your plantings. But you also can transport it right around some of your either old growth trees, or some of the trees that you're trying to really invest in. Maybe you have a madrone stand that you really love, and you're seeing some of them with blight. You can mulch around those trees. But I think it's helpful to think about it potentially as concentrating around your sort of key objectives in your forest. Certainly it's going to be beneficial if you just kind of toss it willy-nilly, but I think to really see the benefit and sort of maximize the benefit, either planting into it or concentrating it around some of the trees that you're trying to invest in, or shrubs that you're trying to invest in, is a really great way to use it. And in terms of the amount, so that 20 tons per hectare, which we used for the farm study, that basically ends up being half a 5 gallon bucket per square meter. So you think about a 3x3 space, then you think about a 5 gallon bucket and think of half of that. That was the density that we're looking at, which is, a thin layer of 1.5 inches or so on the whole top of that area. So is that kind of give a framework for the amount?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Other folks, anybody else have questions, or has anybody out there tried manufacturing biochar on any scale in their woods?
Go ahead, Robert.
Kai, would you talk a little bit about biochar depth, how deep it goes? It sounds like what you're just describing is a surface application, and and I from your lecture here, it sounds like we're trying to get down into root growth, and I'm not sure that tree root growth is at the surface. So could you talk a little more about the depth?
Great question. So a few things there. So one, with the conservation burn methodology that I spoke about, basically just a burn pile that you put out. I'm just trying to emphasize how easy it is. Really, just any burn pile, just put it out when it reaches coal stage. Then it's really easy to incorporate it when you're planting something, right? So that way you're actually trying to literally get it right around the roots as you're filling in your soil around that planting. So that's a great way to get it in, where it's most helpful. But charcoal will filter down into the soil medium over time. It absorbs, that water holding capacity numbers that I showed in both the the forest study as well as the farm soil study, charcoal is absorbing all this water, and then when it freezes, it starts to break up into smaller pieces, similar to your pipes, if you've ever had your pipes freeze, which I have. And so that expansion and breaking apart is slowly creates smaller and smaller particles that then can incorporate and move down into the soil environment. And so partly that's a time scale issue, right? And so you have to wait a bit, but also putting it around the drip line of trees is one of the most helpful ways to sort of maximize that influence around the areas that are most sensitive with roots, right? The area of the drip line, which is the exterior of where the leaves or needles are on the tree, that's where the roots are most able to accumulate and capture water and nutrients. And so that can be a great way to sort of create this ring around their most sensitive roots, and then slowly over time, that charcoal will be incorporated. Now, you certainly can incorporate it, and in an agricultural context, lightly tilling it into the first 3 or 4 inches is a great way to incorporate it. But rarely are we tilling our forests, nor would I ever really recommend it. So that's where the time scale piece of letting it, concentrating it where you want it, and then giving it some time to break down and go lower into the soil environment.
And for your forest study, was that just scattered charcoal on top, or was it somehow?
No, we incorporated it into a 1.5 foot depth at equal amounts in that. So we actually extracted all of the soil from these holes and mixed in the charcoal at an even rate, and then put the sapling tree in, and then put all of the soil back in the planting hole with that rate. So a good illustration of how, again, if you're planting something, that's the time to use charcoal, is incorporated in with the soil that you're packing then around the roots of that plant.
Yeah, Robert, go ahead.
Is biochar commercially available in the San Juans?
That is a great question. And Robert, I have been banging my head on that one for a very long time. So there are a few spots that you can get it, and some great people. Andrew Borner has been selling charcoal in the islands. He lives on Shaw Island, and somebody that would be great to get in touch with, because he is probably the most active person in biochar sales in the area. Black Owl Biochar also sells it commercially up in Bellingham, at least last time I knew, which was about a year ago. There's some areas further south, Oregon, Biochar Direct, and then there's also some areas in California that are selling it really at scale. So there are areas where the markets are more developed, and again, I would say Oregon and in California have much more established markets than in Washington. And when you have more established markets, the price points are able to come way down. And so then it's really commercially viable for farmers to be able to afford it. Whereas right now it's pretty much sold as a boutique sort of high-end product in San Juan County and or just sort of the region. San Juan County is not unique in that. And that's challenging for it to enter into and make economic sense for farmers, but it certainly still can make sense for gardeners. I still would recommend people making it themselves because also it's really doable with the biomass from your home.
Absolutely. I was just going to put in a plug for that having worked with Kai for several years now, we've incorporated biochar manufacturing into a lot of our workshops and have used both the conservation burn pile method and the flame cap kiln, just bringing in, simply burn barrels, and definitely an appropriate technology, something very simple, easy to understand, accessible to most woodland owners. And if you're wondering, where to generate the biomass, the woody biomass that you'll convert to biochar. In my experience, most woodland owners, whether you're in the San Juans or elsewhere, have forests that I would consider to be overstocked. Certainly overstocked compared to the long-term carrying capacity of the site, and therefore require some degree of thinning. When you're thinning these stands, inevitably they're going to generate a certain amount of non-merchantable woody biomass, material that you can't sell, say in log form. These are usually defective trees, small diameter trees, suppressed trees, what have you. And then of course, a lot of limbs, branches, treetops. It's that kind of material that you need to figure out what to do with. You can't sell it, it's hard to get it off site. And so there are a lot of options for that. One of them being, I would consider biochar. So aggregating some of that non-commercial, typically a little bit smaller diameter material, and then either aggregating that into a conservation burn pile or having it stacked and ready to go and feeding it into a flame cap kiln is a great way to process that into clearly a long-lived, highly ecologically valuable product. So like I mentioned, we have a workshop coming up on Lopez Island this Saturday. We're going to be talking about different thinning techniques at that forest, demonstrating some thinning techniques, and then also talking about what range of material that comes out of these thinning practices is viable to use for biochar. Obviously, Kai, being the Forest Health Director for the Conservation District of the San Juans, is a resource to all of you if you want to look him up. And Kai, does the Conservation District still loan out flame cap kilns to folks, or is that
That's a great question. They have about 4 years ago. We totally lost track of where they went. We had a sign-up sheet and then realized that our sign-up sheet was way out of date with who actually had them, and we weren't able to find them again. So at some point soon, we are hoping to really get that program back. But at this point in time, we do not any longer have flame cap kilns to loan out.
All right. If anybody knows who has the Conservation District's flame cap kilns, please contact
exactly.
Kai. They've gone missing.
Please, exactly.
All right. I'll tell you what, it's 8:30, folks. I think, this topic is a great segue for our topic next week. We've got kind of a double hitter this month. We're going to be bringing in Carson Springer, consulting forester in the San Juans, who did his master's studies on the fire ecology in the San Juan Islands. And he'll be talking about fire ecology in Northwest forests, both from a historical perspective and certainly from a climate change perspective. And Kyle will be joining us for that as well and lending his perspective on that. So I'm taking a little bit of a deeper dive into the role of fire in Northwest ecosystems and specifically in the San Juan Islands. So join us again next week at the same time, if that's available to you. And with that, out of respect for our time, I'd like to say, Kai, thank you very much for joining us. And this session has been recorded. So if you do want to go back and take a look at some of the slides and some of the nutrient-dense information that Kai provided us, we'll be putting this up on our YouTube channel relatively shortly, and you can take a look at it there. So with that, again, thank you for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you at a future Fireside chat. So good night to you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.